Hi, everybody. I'm delighted to say that for this week, I'll be interviewing Karen Jones, who is an associate professor of philosophy here in Australia at the University of Melbourne. As you know, I assigned her paper on trustworthiness as one of the first readings for this course. And I'm really excited that in addition to reading the PDF and thinking about it and talking about it in class, you also get a chance to hear straight from Karen about her work. Karen, thanks so much for joining us.
Cool. It's fantastic to be here, and thank you for assigning that paper. And let me also just add that I am available via email. So if you've got any questions that emerge from reading that paper or from our discussion today, you can flick those to me via email, and I'll try and respond to them. So
that's really generous of you. Thank you. Well, let's just get started right in with the questions. So the title of the paper is Trustworthiness. And you remark near the beginning of the paper that there's been a decent amount of work on the attitude of trust and the relationship of trusting someone, but at least up until you had written this paper, much less on the other sort of flip side of the equation, which is the disposition of trustworthiness. Can you say a bit more about why you think it's philosophically fruitful to start from an account of this disposition of trustworthiness rather than the attitude of trust?
Yeah, it's probably a little bit of an overstatement to say we should start from the trustworthiness rather than the trust. But I'm going to do a hand gesture for this, right? Trust and trustworthiness fit together like left hand and right hand, right? So when you've got an account of trust, you can see sort of like reading reverse writing in a mirror, right? What somebody must have been thinking about trustworthiness. And that's because they stand together in the normative relation of fit. So your trust gets it right when you target someone who is trustworthy. And trustworthiness should be recognized in the attitude of trust, right? So if trustworthiness is some big complicated thing, but the attitude of trust is something simple, then they don't fit together like left hand and right hand. You're not seeing them as paired concepts. So because they're paired concepts, there's a sense in which you can start at either end, right? It doesn't matter. You're trying to get a pair. But my frustration when I wrote that paper was that everybody was coming up with a set of different counterexamples. You had this very much kind of puzzle case literature, and there was no convergence. People kind of, it seemed to me, weren't getting anywhere. And you might just go, well, that's because some people have got the wrong kinds of intuitions, right? But I found my own intuitions about trust being very variable, very subject to shift and change depending on how a particular example was presented, right? So it led me to think that we were kind of hitting a bit of a stall point, approaching it from the trust side. So if you hit a stall point and you've got two concepts that fit together like this, and each side of that paired relationship is setting constraints on the other side, well, if you haven't got enough constraints working, because we're not getting consensus, and we've been talking about this for quite a time now, what if you just flip it around and start from the other side? So it would be an overstatement to think that I think it's trustworthiness first. Actually, I think it's both ends. But when I was writing that, there was this frustration that we were just pursuing it from one end and that we weren't really getting anywhere. So when you hit a stall, how about flipping perspectives? Let's see what we can do from the trustworthiness side and see if we can get a little bit more leverage. And I guess I think that we do get more leverage, or we did get more leverage than we had at that time by switching perspectives to the trustworthiness side. So
that's interesting. So, I mean, you've written about trust and its relation to affect in the past, and I guess you kind of see this kind of interdefinability in a lot of affective attitudes. So you might have a theory of disgust, and you could inform yourself further by having a theory of what's disgusting, or a theory of contempt and a theory of what's contemptible, or a theory of admiration and a theory of the admirable. So a lot of these attitudes and the dispositions that they're meant to track are kind of interdefinable in this way, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. Though I don't think you have to buy into a affective attitude account to think that you're looking for partnered accounts of trust and trustworthiness. But it's going to be really super salient to you if you are approaching it that way, precisely because of the literature about fitting, so-called fitting attitudes, right? And there's a sense in which trustworthiness is met and recognized by trust, and trust is a fitting response to trustworthiness. So it's kind of obvious to you if you approach it from that way, but you can actually not buy into the whole affective attitude thing. You could just think trust is some kind of cognitive judgment about the, insert your preferred theory of trustworthiness, the competence or the reliability or whatever it is. You could have just this purely cognitive view and still think you need to treat the concepts as paired concepts. So
Right.
I guess it's obvious if you come from the affective attitude side, but everybody should agree with this. And where possible, and this will come up later on in our interview, right? Obviously, I've got, at this point, quite a lot of commitments about quite a lot of choice points within the domain of theorizing about trust and trustworthiness, right? I've got kind of a whole theory in the background there, but I think it's actually really important to see where you can go as ecumenical as possible. And that's actually going to come up when we talk about rich trustworthiness. So yes, it's really obvious to see these together if you've got an affective attitude approach. But I reckon even if you don't have that approach, you can get some theoretical benefits by switching your perspective. And if you started just from the trustworthiness side, switch your perspective. What are you committed to saying about your trust side? Do you like what you're committed to saying about your trust side, given what you've said about your trustworthiness? If you don't, go back to what you said about your trustworthiness, and vice versa. And I think everybody should be able to accept that methodology independent of their other theoretical commitments. And that's kind of nice because it's interesting to see where we can get common ground in order to hone in on where the necessary choice points are, where we can't possibly have common ground. So.
Right. Great. Well, so then my next question is to do with this distinction that you make between 3-place and 2-place accounts of trustworthiness. Can you say a bit more about what the places are and how they're defined in the 3-place account that you offer?
Yeah, effectively, the 3 places are A, B, and a domain of interaction, D. Now, who's the A and who's the B, right? Well, A is the person who is trustworthy. Now, is A always a person? I don't think so. I think A is always an agent. And on my view, it has to be quite a reflective agent. So my doggy is not trustworthy, like cute, fluffy, but not trustworthy, yeah, friendly, won't bite me, but not trustworthy with respect to biting, because the concept of trustworthiness, I think, just doesn't apply at that level. So we're talking about agents and quite sophisticated agents, but it doesn't follow that the only agents or the only potentially sophisticated agents are individual human beings, right? So in the place of A and B can be individuals and often are. So my doctor and me, for example, your philosophy professor and you, for example, but they can also be institutions and people functioning in particular roles. So I think we can plausibly talk about people trusting governments, trusting universities, trusting firms and businesses. Further question, should you do this? Maybe not, but we can talk about those as trustworthy because they are agents, yeah? And then our question is, what kinds of things are domains? And this is actually going to come up, I think, as our discussion continues on a little bit. So what can be domains? Education, healthcare. But then we've got a lot of domains that are hard to individuate, right? So, what do you trust your friend for? You might think you trust them for everything, but actually you probably don't. Because, we all know that we ourselves and our friends have got certain areas where you can't go with them. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. You've just got to understand what these things are, So
especially when it's a domain that requires a lot of expertise. Like, my friends should not trust me to do surgery on them.
Oh, good heavens, no. Yes, good. And just in common sense terms, you just never think about that, right? Which is why I think we've got to bring domains into focus. Some people have wanted to say, flipping from the trustworthiness side to the trust side, that trust is primarily an attitude directed towards a person. So it's not even 3-place. But I think that's not right, because there's always this kind of, even though it is an attitude directed towards the person, it's not directed towards you in virtue of your capacity to perform surgery, right? And your friend might be really trustworthy, but actually not for helping you with a medical appointment. And there could be a really good reason, maybe they watched their parent die of cancer, right? And just anything medical is kind of triggering and traumatizing. Well, then that's going to be a domain in which you don't go to your friend, right, for support, because they're not going to be trustworthy with respect to that domain. You go to them for other things, but it doesn't mean you don't have a good quality friendship with that person. Yeah. So that's
Great.
A, B, and D.
We skipped C. Right. So in this account, B is trustworthy with respect to A in domain D, if and only if B is competent in that domain and would take A's counting on her as a compelling reason to act as counted on. It seems to me that there's at least 3 thresholds kind of built into that account. So first, there's the kind of competence threshold. You don't need to be, the world-leading expert. You just need to be competent enough. And I guess this raises a question of like, well, how much is enough? Is it solely a matter of skill, or do the stakes matter? Like, do I want someone to have more expertise when they're practicing surgery on me than when they're cooking for me? Or maybe something else is going on. I guess the second threshold has to do with how broadly D is defined. So you mentioned education, but that seems to me to be too broad, because you might want one person to teach you math and someone else to teach you poetry. And maybe you want one person to teach you geometry and another to teach you algebra. So we can carve up the domains much more broadly or much more fine-grained. And that, again, raises questions about, like, is there a right way to carve things up? And then I guess third, there's this question of what counts as a compelling reason. I guess you don't think that a compelling reason is always overriding, but it has to be at least sometimes overriding. And then the question is like, well, how often, what strength of other reasons has to be involved, and so on. So can you address these 3 thresholds?
Yeah, I can, but I'm not going to be able to say something that's going to satisfy everybody. So let me back up a little bit before I have a best crack and say a little bit about why I'm not worried by something that some people might be worried by. Here's the thing, you might go, hey, have you got an account here? Right? Or is it also loosey-goosey? I mean, you've got competence, you've got compelling, you've got domains. How do you individuate your domains? What's your competence threshold? What is it to take something to be compelling? You haven't actually got an account if you've got these 3 strands of wriggle room, right? You haven't even got a decent account. You're just sort of gesturing towards a muddle or a puddle of possible considerations that could come in, right? Now, that was not the question you asked me. I've put in a more hostile frame, right? But you can see how you could get to that sort of more hostile way of framing it if you point out that there's these 3 different kinds of wiggle room in my account. You might just go, well, it's all just loosey-goosey. This isn't even an account. It's just like a loosey-goosey gesture, right? Now, I think we should not expect to be able to say precisely what's involved in domains and competence thresholds and being a compelling reason, right? In the sense that I think we shouldn't expect ourselves to be able to say, clearly an untrustworthy person. Clearly they fall below the competence threshold. Clearly they're confused about the domains, right? Or clearly they're not taking this to be a compelling reason, right? They haven't given it enough weight to count as compelling, as if I could somehow put numbers on competence or put numbers on amount of compelling and go, you're not trustworthy. You failed to meet the threshold, right? And why would we think this is true? Precisely because who is trustworthy and who is not trustworthy is often subject to really genuine and legitimate disagreement. And that's precisely because we can't put fixed numerical values on this. And I think if we had a theory that would allow us to do this and sort of put assessment of someone as trustworthy into a hopper and crank a handle and get a verdict like trustworthy or trustworthy to such and such a degree, would actually have gone wrong in our theorizing. And as Annette Beyer mentioned ages ago in her paper, this means someone who is untrustworthy's got a certain capacity for a nefarious wriggle route. They can go, oh, no, of course I'm trustworthy. It just happened there was this other much more important thing going on at the time, right? So they could disguise untrustworthiness, appealing to these kinds of wriggle room in my account, right? So that's always a possibility. And I think if you had an account that insisted you have to be able to resolve all these questions, right, in a way that was beyond dispute, you'd have an account that couldn't capture the phenomenon we're trying to capture, because it's just not like that. It just doesn't admit of hard and fast differences. So in terms of competence, sometimes we are just talking about a clear threshold. So, you know, who's a competent doctor? Those who are able to perform within relevant expectations of professional performance. Yeah, and that means it's kind of on and off. There might be a little bit of a fuzzy border, or are you actually able to perform that well? But then take other kinds of cases, because some domains are actually complicated in the skills you might need to navigate within them. And so you could actually have more than one competence being involved in response to a domain. Mm-hmm. Example, suppose a workmate comes to you and they're concerned about, say, a possible tension that's developing in connection with a colleague, right? And they're coming to you because they trust you. You're trying to be trustworthy in this domain where you're tasked with renegotiating working relationships. Now, what kinds of skills would you have to do that? You'd have to really have some moral smarts, including recognition of reasons of friendship, reasons of collegiality. You could, depending on the situation, have to have a lot of institutional smarts, right? What in this particular work environment, right, would constitute an appropriate move to settling this kind of thing? Some places have hierarchical structures. Sometimes those hierarchical structures break down. You'd have to have all this kind of practical smarts plus institutional knowledge, plus some moral capacities, right? And all that would be involved in competence with respect to good workplace relationships. Right? So your competences could be multi-stranded. And I think you're right that sometimes what counts as having a competence is going to depend on what's at stake, like how much competence we need is going to depend on what's at stake. So yeah, I guess that's just right. In terms of individuating domains, a lot of them are block individuated by our social practices and their relevant expectations. And this is, you know, when we talk about, well, who's a trustworthy teacher? We've got something in mind about what is teachers are accountable for. And it's not just the conveying of content, right? It's supporting people as learners and so on, but it's not everything. You don't go to your teacher for certain kinds of personal support, right? But you might for how to fit your education and its current challenges, right, within your broader life story, right? So we've got a rough and ready sense of how to individuate domains that is quite socially specific, yeah? And then beyond that, what do? I think we start as a base with this kind of social grasp of what's involved in domains, but we also engage if we're encountering people more than one time, or if we're redesigning institutions, this isn't just necessarily individual, we come to processify those domains according to shared understandings as it emerges. So does that mean the notion of a domain is really loosey-goosey? It is kind of, but I don't think it is, you know, theory destroying loosey-goosey. I think it is roughly what we would expect it to be, right? And then this is going to send us back to like Aristotle, right? You can only be as precise as the phenomenon will allow you to be, and sometimes it takes quite a bit of practical wisdom to work out what domain is an issue for a person. Yeah, and sometimes, of course, you can fail to be trustworthy with respect to a person because you've got no idea how they're individuating domains, or they're individuating domains very eccentrically, right? Yeah. And then you're going to fail to be trustworthy with respect to that person.
Mm.
And for me, that's not something necessarily with a moral bite, right? It might be that there's nothing wrong with you, that you're not trustworthy with respect to a person, with respect to a domain. Right? It could be that they want you to be trustworthy with respect to various domains of nefarious criminal activity, right? Or it could be that you have a communication issue such that you can't work out what the relevant domains would be for this person, and you are going to let them down if they trust you. Right?
I had this in Spain recently. Someone was asking me for directions, and I had no idea. Also, I can barely speak Spanish. So they should not be trusting me to tell them where to go.
Yeah, and that's okay. And what you should do then, of course, is communicate that. And that's what takes us into the domain that I've been thinking of as rich trustworthiness, which in a way I think is the more theoretically interesting concept in that paper. More interesting than, say, three-place trustworthiness, because what you did, right, was you told them, look, I don't know. Though it was Annette Beyer who originally told this story. She reckoned that, and so I don't know if this is actually true by relevant social norms, right? But Annette Beyer reports that it was reported to her, so we're third hand, right? That in Egypt, it's considered rude not to try and help people. So even if you don't really know and someone asks you for directions, you just kind of like make some vague indications, which, you know, is not what we expect here, right? We expect if you don't know, you just say, I don't know, right? And there's nothing rude about saying, I don't know. So you could have all these kinds of communication problems where it gets hard to match you and your trustworthiness up with a potential trustor because of communication problems on either side. And those can involve lots of things. But one thing they often do involve is like, what are the relevant domains? How are we individuating domains?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. Well, so one question that sort of you've already addressed a little bit has to do with what can occupy the A role and the B role. So in the paper, at least, I think most of the examples are individuals. But you said earlier that actually you think that as long as it's an agent with a certain level of sophistication, I guess mostly cognitive sophistication, and maybe social as well, then that they can fill that role. So that would involve, I'm thinking especially for this class, doctors, nurses, the medical establishment more broadly, artifacts. So there are people who say they trust or don't trust vaccines. Maybe what they mean when they say that is they do or don't trust the people who develop, test, and distribute vaccines. And that's just kind of a metonymy or something. And then in non-medical sectors as well, like government, industry, there's a lot of discussion these days about whether AI or algorithms more broadly can be trustworthy. I tend to think not, but there's certainly a lot of talk about this. If you talk to anyone who got involved with blockchain, you'll hear them talk about it as a trustworthy technology, or a technology that replaces trust with algorithms. It seems to me that there's a lot of possibilities here, and it's not clear whether people are making wise choices when they think about trusting non-human individuals. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think when we're talking about non-human individuals, we are talking kind of metaphorically. So when we talk about trusting vaccines, we are thinking, are those vaccines safe and reliable? But sometimes, of course, when we talk about trusting vaccines, what we're talking about is trusting the institutions that get vaccines to us, right? So, and that's actually a whole bunch of different institutions. So it's the research institutions, right? Testing institutions, but also certifying institutions. So it can involve both, you know, university sector, for example, but also the government sector through APAGI, the Therapeutic Goods Administration. So lots of both individuals and institutions can be involved. Now, sometimes we have got a trust B and a domain of interaction D where they're individuals, but that trust relationship is made possible only because of an institutional background. And that's what I take it's the case with doctors and nurses, frequently it is actually the patient who trusts that individual, who is their doctor and who is their nurse, but does so in virtue of the certification practices of institutions that are themselves trusted, right? So you've got a trust in it. You definitely got individuals in the A and B place on both the trustworthiness side and the trust side. But that's happening because of an institutional background where you also have trust in that institutional background. And, you know, when my earlier work on trust, some people bounced back at me and said, look, this theorizes relationships. This is Simon Blackburn did this. This theorizes relationships between individuals quite well, but it just doesn't theorize relations between an individual and an institution or between two institutions, right? Because why would we think there is this kind of responsiveness to the fact of dependency on the part of that institution? Yeah, but I actually reckon there can be, so long as we remember that it need not be, right? Because me personally, right, trust my member of parliament, right, or my representative is responsive to me personally and my dependents. But in good political institutions, for example, people are responsive to the dependency of their constituents. Right? In well-designed universities, and we've got some reason to be a bit worried about our university design at the moment, right? Universities are responsive to that which the community counts on them for, and that I take to be primarily not corrupting the youth, but training them, and also producing knowledge, right? And sort of certifying things as quality goods if we're looking for information through both certifying the people who might produce them, right, but also through peer review and other kinds of processes. And if the universities cease to be responsive to the demands that I take it as the community has on them through their expectations, right, they can cease to be trustworthy. And they can do that if, for example, they put diplomatic missions or money or all kinds of things ahead of that core knowledge generating, inquiry driven function of the university. So I guess I do take it that it's possible for individuals to trust institutions and for two institutions to stand in these kinds of relationships to each other when there are the appropriate accountability structures that enable responsiveness to the ways in which one of those institutions needs to count on the other. ATAGI needs to count on the universities, to go back to the vaccine example, right? Yeah, or individuals can also function in this way. So if you think it's got to be responsiveness to the fact that me, in virtue of my personal properties, you know, as an individual, you're responding to me as an individual. No, you just might be responding to me as a patient, as a constituent, to the university responding to the community. All those things I think are actually possible. So.
That's really helpful, and I think it connects with the next question that I wanted to ask. So in the paper, you argue that trust and trustworthiness are really important because we humans are finite, social, and reflective. And I'd like to ask you to say a bit more about that, because it does seem to some extent that our sociality is a kind of like a double-edged sword. It can be empowering when we place our trust well, but it can sort of expose our finitude even further when we trust poorly. And so my question is, like, do you think that someone can hone their reflective capacities well enough to be good at trusting in general? Is there a kind of practical wisdom to trust, a phronesis of trust? Or would you say that it's more of a patchwork, like I might be good at trusting people to make restaurant recommendations, not particularly good at trusting people to tell me who to vote for, and there's no domain general capacity that I could try to cultivate or train up?
I think it would be awesome if we could try to cultivate and train up a domain general capacity, but I'm a little bit skeptical about our ability to do that. And one of the reasons I am is, you know, I think placing trust well, when we're going to get to this later on, I know, is a matter that falls between one who is trustworthy and one who would trust, right? So there's two sides to this, to get the match between somebody who has a dependency that they really could and would benefit from securing someone else's agential capacity to support them, right, in that limitation, right? And people who have that ability, right? And one of the things that I think is true is that communication is just really, really hard. And that's really hard for a whole bunch of reasons. Could you realistically understand what all those reasons are? I think it would be exceptionally hard, because the level of understanding and knowledge you'd need to have would be really quite vast. So sometimes you get miscommunications, right? And so a person who would trust doesn't know where to place that trust. Even though some people are trying to help them out, but that person's had a bad experience, or they belong to a group that's had a bad experience. Think about First Nation Australians and trusting the medical profession. You know, there's a lot of reasonable, well-grounded distrust going on there. And then you've got medical professions that are perhaps ignorant of that history, right? So we would need to get over a lot of ignorance, including a lot of motivated ignorance, a lot of white ignorance, in order to promote trust across different racial and cultural groups, for example. So I think it's spectacularly difficult. I would like to think it could be achieved. Do I realistically think it can be achieved? No. But here's what I hope can be achieved. That by reflection, we might come to better understand gaps in our potential to trust wisely. And then we have the option of calling on others not to eliminate our trust, right, but to support us in trusting wisely, in which case we might get whole communities of trust and trustworthiness. Or I might, not outsource is too strong a word, right, but I might trust someone else to help me place my trust wisely. And of course, that's something we do all the time when we've got good certification bodies. You know, if I want to know about vaccines which work, right, and this is why certain forms of conspiracy theory, so take us sideways, can be so undermining, though, right? It's like, I can't work that out. I need to know who to trust, right? So I need to look at who is certifying whom. But then if I don't trust who is certifying whom,
yeah,
where do I go, right? And that's, of course, what some people who have gone down anti-vax rabbit holes or echo chambers, right? They're undermining the trust in those who we might use to help us place our trust wisely. Does that make sense? So we get whole interconnected strands. So I guess I do hope that we could come to understand the areas in which we can't ourselves trust wisely, and have some sense of who we could go to, who we could trust to help us trust wisely.
Yeah, I think that this is a really important and kind of understudied phenomenon. I was actually going to ask you about it next. In some of my work, I've called it meta trust or second order trust. So it's basically like, I need an answer to a question. I don't even know who to ask, but I do know who to ask to tell me who to ask.
Yes.
That sort of thing. I mean, it seems maybe kind of very sophisticated, but I think we do it all the time.
I think we do. Yeah, we do. And actually we do that, you know, even in like primary school, when you want to find out something about something, or even a friend, right? And which friends do you go to be reliable, right? About which kinds of information about which other persons, right? So we actually do this all the time. And is it meta trust? Yeah, it is. It's sort of functioning in the background, which is interesting, because it can mean that when you trust somebody, there's actually a further layer of trust behind that trust. Sometimes when you distrust someone, you might think, oh, problem in our economy of trust, we've got distrust going on here, but there could be a layer of trust behind the distrust. right? When you're trusting someone who's saying like, not over there, don't place your reliance with that sort of person. Yeah. So I think we do this all the time. And I think this shows some truth to a metaphor that's being contested in the literature on trust. And that's whether we should think of trust as a fabric that undergirds our society as a whole. And some people are just like love the fabric, or sometimes even the atmosphere metaphor. And other people, Russell Harden in particular, but there's a lot of these people. Hawley is another person. I want to say, no, trust is quite a specific phenomenon. We shouldn't expect it to be like a fabric or an atmosphere. Right? That's to confuse it with reliance, that's to find it in too many places. But when we look at how trust or distrust in a person can be undergirded by trust or distrust in someone else, we might start to see these kind of interconnected webs, fabrics, atmospheres at work.
Yeah, oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, I've just moved from talking about trustworthiness to talking about trust. And every now and again, this makes me a little crazy when I'm talking to people about trustworthiness and they keep bouncing back to me and talking about trust. But if the concepts fit together like this, we should expect that to happen.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, I think I like the fabric metaphor more than the atmosphere metaphor. In some of the empirical work that I've been doing with Colin Klein, we actually try to map these things out as networks. And once you have network structures, you can ask things like, should trust be like transitive? So A trusts B, B trusts C. Now A is faced with this question like, oh, do I trust C? And if I don't, does that mean that I should withdraw my trust in B? Because obviously they made some kind of bad judgment here.
Yeah. And holding domain a constant, of course, through those.
Yes.
I can trust B in one domain, B can trust C in some other related domain. Is this going to work? We've got to, there will be some kinds of trust relations which we might expect to have that structure, right? But people can be trustworthy with respect to some persons, but not other persons. So, you know, in the B is trustworthy with respect to A. And why is it in that reverse? Because I want to say A trusts B, right? B is trustworthy with respect to A in a domain, right? In certain kinds of cases, that could be because of something quite particular about A. And so just the fact that B is trustworthy with respect to A doesn't mean that in a domain, doesn't mean they're going to be trustworthy with respect to C or whatever else occupying that secondary position. And we know this. It's a kind of common sense in a way, right? With friends. A friend can be trustworthy in a whole bunch of domains for you, but not for somebody who isn't their friend.
Yeah, I think that's right. I guess one way I've been thinking about it is like, at least when we're thinking about the competence component of trustworthiness, usually when someone has high competence, they also are decent at assessing other people's competence.
Yes.
So if someone makes a very bad judgment about someone else's competence in a domain, that can give you a reason to wonder whether they really are competent in that domain as well.
Yes, it can. It can. So, and so what is this exchange telling us? I think it tells us something that as philosophers who like very high levels of abstraction, we could feel disappointed in, but I'm not going to feel disappointed in it because I'm a little bit more inclined towards wanting to get down and dirty and individuating and making distinctions. So to be more inclined to look at the particulars rather than at least immediately search for the principles. And what I think it tells us is that trust and trustworthiness, we should expect a lot of complexity. We should expect domain sensitivity. We should expect agential sensitivity, right? And then we've got a question if we want to, say, talk about how to promote more trustworthiness, right? Or how better to signal the trustworthiness we have in order that it's more available to would-be trusters. We sometimes have to go down into the details of the particulars, and we can specify at a high level of generality a few things, right? But the nitty gritty could be in the particulars if we want to look at, say, how to enhance trustworthiness in universities, trustworthiness on the part of medical professions and so on. We might not have a one-size-fits-all program that we can wheel out for that. And I guess I think that's what we should expect. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that that's probably right. Just moving on a little bit, at one point in the paper, you allude to this phenomenon that's sometimes called therapeutic trust.
Yes.
And the basic idea there is that the trusted individual might not have been trustworthy before trust was placed in them, but that realizing that they are trusted can lead them to rise to the occasion. And I guess this can happen in a few different ways. So one way is maybe they, by finding out that they're trusted, they get some confidence. And when they have that confidence, they believe in themselves, they're more likely to exercise their competence effectively. And I guess the second way that it could work would be related not to their competence, but to their motivation. So as you know, Philip Pettit and Victoria McGeer have gone back and forth about this a bit. And Pettit suggested early on that people like to be esteemed. They like to be thought highly of. One way to be esteemed is to be trusted. And so if you put your trust in someone, that gives them a reason to prove trustworthy because they don't want to give up that esteem. McGeer seems to think that that's a bit cynical and that it could even backfire. I think I know what your take on this debate is, but maybe you could spell it out for us a bit.
I reckon this debate is one McGeer wins hands down. And that's because the cynicism of the first strategy is actually revealed, I think, if what was going on were to be made transparent to the person whose trust mechanism, trust responsiveness you're trying to elicit, right? They'd go like, what? You don't actually esteem me? Right? You just want to give the appearance that you do, right? In order that you can elicit something from me, right? So it wouldn't survive a kind of reflective awareness of the mechanisms that were involved, which makes it, I think, inherently unstable. Whereas McGeer's idea of scaffolding people's agency would survive awareness that that's what's going on, right? And it's actually a mechanism we use, you know, when a parent looks down at a kid and says, you're a big girl now and mummy is counting on you. And that's actually doing two things: scaffolding a sense of agential competence, but also making it explicit exactly what is being counted on, because often, you know, people don't know what is being counted on. So you're helping them hone in on the relevant domain, right? And also see themselves as competent within that domain. And it's sort of similar, you know, imagine, say, a parent leaving a teenager in charge of the house, and the teenager's been a little bit irresponsible in the past, right? But the parent engages in saying, okay, the fact that they might screw up, I'm just going to bracket that as a reason. I'm just going to do it, right? So that's one parent. We'll just bracket that. And the other parent is, oh, they have been screwing up, right? Oh, but I need to show them that I trust them. Okay, look, I'll have the neighbor just like really discreetly have a wee peep in and maybe text me if there's like an issue, right? And one is faking trust. You're not actually trusting in that second kind of case, right? You're faking that you are trusting, right? Because really you're bringing the neighbor in to do a little bit of checking out in a way that fakes your trust, right? If the kid were to learn that you've done the second thing, right, that would actually not be at all helpful and could in fact give rise to kind of the pushback behavior that teenagers do, you know, and just like, well, you don't trust me, so, you know, we'll just like show that that is perfectly warranted, right? Whereas the first would be capable of bootstrapping that kind of trust responsiveness precisely because it's a very genuine form of trust. Whereas I think this idea that you are genuinely trusting, you could be entrusting, giving the person something to care for, but the idea that you're genuinely trusting when you are appealing to this mechanism of esteem that Pettit talks about It's like, actually, I think you're probably not. Right?
Yeah.
As soon as the person becomes aware of that, they're going to go like, oh, you manipulative.
I'll show you.
You manipulative person. And it won't work. And that's actually a sort of trick of therapeutic trust. It has to have a kind of sincerity to actually work. Otherwise, it's faking it. And faking it has different potential to work. Because, you know, if you fake it and you get away with faking it, maybe it will work as if it was the real deal. But that's still a different thing.
Right. Well, so I think this connects to the next question I wanted to ask. So you recommend in the paper that people's trustworthiness can be enhanced by cutting away their conflicts of interest. And in so doing, that their dependency responsiveness becomes more of a compelling reason for them than it would have otherwise been, because there's fewer competing reasons. You might think that if we go out of our way to cut away conflicts of interest like that, what we're actually doing is saying like, no, this person's not trustworthy. We don't actually trust them. We're just going to make sure that they're not tempted. You know, so it's like you leave your teenager at home with the house, but you take all the liquor with you before you leave. It's sort of like trusting, but it could be seen as kind of manipulative in its own different way.
Good. Okay. I hadn't thought about that as a case. We're trying to make it trustworthy by trying to increase how compelling the other reason is, rather than resisting temptation. So what do I think is the difference between that kind of case and the institutional design cases that I had in mind? You know, I think somebody's field of reasons, and by that I just mean those considerations that are available to them that could support decision making, is profoundly socially shaped, and it's shaped by institutions, but also by social practices and history and all sorts of other things too, but let's just focus in on the social, right? So you can set someone up and design an institution such that it would take a saint to function well in that institution, or not, right? And preferably not, since most of us aren't saintly, right? And I guess that's what I'm trying to get at in this is, I think most of us, right, are actually inclined to be moved by the ways in which other people count on us or might wish to count on us. Most of us are social. Right? We're willing to have our agency be recruited by other people, and we want to be able to recruit other people's agency in return because of our finitude, right? Coming back to sociality and finitude, right? But we're also tempted. So how do you set up an institution? One thing you might try and do is, let's make it so that the person in that role, even if they are a knave, right, must be able to deliver the verdict we want. Well, good luck with that, right?
Sort of Hobbesian approach.
Yeah, good luck with that. You're just actually not going to succeed with that, I think, because you can't make institutional design bulletproof. Oh, and interesting, like it's going to come up in your class later. Right? Could you try and remove the agents, right, by talking about algorithms taking over decision making? An algorithm can't have self-interest, right? Could you try and do that? I reckon that's not going to work either, right? But what you could try and do is tamp down some of the institution forces that kick up opposing reasons. What do I mean? Go to the academy, right, where there has been in certain areas, right, claims that institutional forces are actually behind poor research, plagiarism, bad research design. Well, what would those forces be? Got to get a lot of grants, right? Got to publish by the kilo, actually by the tens of kilos, right? So a kind of fast-paced thing that rewards corner cutting. Now, if we want our institutions to produce people with the skills and capacities to engage in high-level inquiry about a range of topics. And then we want to have refereeing systems and so on that certifies their output as available for people to use to make really important decisions on the basis of, right? We don't want people cutting corners, right? We don't want this economy that rewards by tonnage. And we don't want certain esteem measures, right, that also put in place incentive to cut these kinds of corners. And similarly, you might think this is going on sometimes in both medical research, but in the delivery of medical services. Right? So what you want to do is create institutions that don't pull you in the wrong direction. So no, I'm not actually saying you've got no pull in the right direction, right? Or you are yourself deeply inclined to be pulling in the wrong direction. I don't think most people who enter scientific research at universities are deeply inclined, right, to be pulled for markers of prestige rather than genuinely getting it right. I think mostly people want to genuinely get it right. They're responsive to that as an ideal and the ways in which the community might count on them for that in their academic role. Right? But when that's met with a published by the kilo, actually by the tens of kilos, maybe published by the ton, right? And with various perverse incentives going on in the refereeing process, you can make the fact that people are counting on you slip. Right? There's just too many other reasons. And those other reasons don't have to be there. You're putting them there in your institutional design. So stop it.
Really interesting.
So stop
it. One of the things that I've seen in a few of these questionable research practice cases and even outright fraud cases is sort of weaponization of trust. So for instance, Diederik Stapel, the disgraced Dutch social psychologist, he pointed out that he had a lot of postdocs who were dependent on him for their income. And he felt like he had to fabricate results so that he could publish, so that he could get grants, so that he could keep supporting them because they were counting on him. I mean, it's a very strange sort of thing. Presumably none of them, as far as I know, none of them tried to weaponize their own trust. They just thought he was a good guy to work with. But the institutional design is kind of problematic because if you're on a postdoc, then you're always on soft money. You always have to get the next grant. Probably you need some senior person to apply with you. So then that creates this kind of perverse incentive that you just mentioned.
So that's actually a really interesting case. And it's an interesting case of what we started talking about at the beginning of this as well, which is how you can actually, because of issues about domain, who might be counting on you with respect to what, because actually you're trusted across a range of domains as a researcher. Right? So I think this guy was totally having a go by saying, I'm being trustworthy towards my postdocs, which is leading me to be untrustworthy towards the broader institution. It's like he's having a go. It's like, that's a bunch of BS, right? But there's wiggle room for him to try and have that go, right? Yeah. Because we recognize, right, his responsibilities towards postdoctoral fellows, but also we want to recognize his responsibilities as a trainer and generator and certifier of good, solid, robust inquiry. So he was definitely having a go. We shouldn't believe him, but we also shouldn't design institutions in this kind of a way.
Yeah. Okay, so that connects really nicely with the next question, which is about rich trustworthiness, because Stapel was basically saying, no, actually I am trustworthy, just not in the way that you expected me to be. So in the paper, you introduced this idea. I'm actually going to quote it because I really like this sentence. You say, we want the competent who can be counted on in the ways we need to identify themselves. And we want those who are not up for a particular form of dependency, either because they don't have the competence or they don't have the motivation, to identify themselves as well, before we count on them in ways that are apt to be disappointed. So basically, we want people who are trustworthy to show us or tell us that they're trustworthy, and people who are not trustworthy to show or tell us that they're not trustworthy. But it raises a sort of obvious question, because saying just trust me is not a very reliable signal. Don't trust me actually does seem to be a relatively reliable signal, but the trust me doesn't seem to be. And I wonder, what sorts of things people can do to go beyond just trust me in a way that not only signals that they can be trusted, but signals it in a reliable way.
Yeah. I mean, walking the walk is sometimes the best way to signal, because this is important. Some people have been confused about my view and think that I think trustworthiness is trust responsiveness, right? So I've got a trust responsiveness. This is in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Oops. I haven't got a trust responsiveness account of trustworthiness. It is a counting on responsiveness account of trustworthiness. And to trust is more than to merely count on, right? It's to effectively count on them responding to your counting on them, right? So why does this matter? It means you can signal your trustworthiness even when someone doesn't yet trust you, right? Because to be trustworthy is to be such as if they were to count on you, right? You would respond in the relevant way. Now, they might not be counting on you, or they might be counting on you because they've got no choice to count, but to count on you. So if they're counting on you and they don't trust you yet, but it's like, better just do this, okay? You can pass the test of that first counting on, and that can build a relationship, right? You can also try to signal using available cultural resources, which might sometimes mean you're screwed if you try and do it on your own, so you better outsource. Because remember how we were talking about how you can have this fabric atmosphere, maybe we don't like fabric, network fabric of trust and trust relationships. Now, sometimes you're not going to be able to signal that you now at last are trustworthy because you've got so much bad history, right? And actually, I take this to be the case with all Australian universities with respect to institution and group of people, all First Nation Australians, especially my university, the University of Melbourne, which was home for the eugenics movement, right? Which provided the theory for the stolen generations. And, we had the leader of the university, 4 main professors, then we named the buildings after them. So you walk around the campus and the whole campus is like, we are a scary place. We generate theories which say you are inferior and which say we should try to, end all your cultural practices and I'm just going to use the tape speech, breed the black out of you, right? And that's what the University of Melbourne did and other universities in Australia, right? So now the university says, gosh, it'd be nice to have we need some First Nation and some Indigenous Australian research subjects for our medical research. We're producing biased research because we're not researching with these communities, or we want this other community to participate in these ways, or we want First Nation people to engage with us as university. And look, we've learned all these things and now we're so excellently trustworthy, and First Nation people would understand if they just roll their eyeballs. And this came up actually for me, and somebody said, well, do you think informed consent forms can help with communicating our trustworthiness? And I'm like a bureaucratic procedure on the part of an institution that is already not trusted. No, that's not gonna, no. That is actually, how are we gonna make things worse? It's gonna make things look a little bit bureaucratized, legalistic, yeah? So what can you do? Are you totally stuffed? No, but you cannot do it yourself. You have to start, which is going to be a slow process, to broker a relationship with someone else who can then broker that relationship with the group you want to communicate your trustworthiness to. So you effectively necessarily have to go through a mediator in order to repair that reputation. Because if you've screwed up so badly, right, you can say, oh, I'm all right now, I've learned, I've done these things. And say, well, why would anybody believe you? The answer is they wouldn't, right? So sometimes I think the only way you can communicate trustworthiness is by finding an intermediary who you can be difficult, but who you can work to build that relationship. And then that person can effectively say, actually, you can trust these people now. Here's why, here's how, it's okay. So I think sometimes that's actually the only thing we can do. And sometimes we don't even know we need to do this, right? And that is something covered in the paper a little bit, like, because sometimes we don't know, we just interpret our histories differently. Right? And we're like, oh, well, you know, I've been all right, haven't I? And other people are like, you know, no, like totally wildly, crazily untrustworthy in the relevant way. But you don't even sort of see you've got a problem. So getting a grip on that kind of understanding about how people might look at you, right? And look at your past, whether you as an institution or as an individual, is actually a key step, I think, to being able to do this effectively.
That's really interesting. So basically the idea is you need someone who's already trusted by the community in question to vouch for you. So it's closely related to what we were talking about before with transitive trust or meta trust.
It is. It is.
I guess the mediator takes a big risk there, because if they vouch for an institution and people get burned again, then that person is going to almost certainly lose any trust that they had previously.
That's right. And that puts that person in a very vulnerable position, and rightly leads people to think, well, why should I be doing that? You know, why? What's in it for my community? Not what's in it for me, because people do this from, you know, goodness, from commitment to improving relations, from all kinds of reasons. So not what's in it for me, but what's in it for my community, right? That I should put myself at such a level of risk. And often it's actually a little worse than put myself at that risk, because sometimes, you know, when you do this, you're not always the victim of your own misplaced trust. Right? And we know that from clerical abuse, right? Sometimes it's the parents who trust and the children who become the victims, right? So, yeah, you know, and that means building that relationship with a broker is going to be very difficult as well.
Yeah. Okay, well, this I think might connect a little bit with the next question I wanted to ask, which is about what you might call rich trustingness. So you've already got rich trustworthiness. So that's the disposition of the person who is potentially trusted. Rich trustingness would attach to the person who is potentially, you know, looking to place their trust. So the basic idea, as I've been thinking of it, is that someone is richly trusting when they're disposed to reliably signal what kinds of dependencies they're willing to accept and from whom. And this can obviously make someone vulnerable, right? Because you're saying, like, I'm willing to make myself vulnerable, I'm willing to depend. But I think it can also help someone find trustee in the first place. So it's kind of like it takes two to tango. So if the trusting people are not willing to indicate that they're willing to put their trust out, then the trustworthy people don't know who to find. Yeah. And I guess this is especially going to be the case when you have a kind of example that involves mutual trust, where it's not just I trust you in domain D, but also you trust me to do my part in domain D. So like if we're doing collaborative research, or if we're driving somewhere, you drive, I navigate, right? All kinds of joint agency involves this kind of mutual trust. So if I don't tell you, like, look, I'm willing to let you tell me when to turn left or right, then we're not going to drive together as effectively as we would have otherwise.
I love this question because I really hadn't thought about rich trustingness, but as rich trustingness as to whether you could go to place here in the same way I have gone for the trustworthy side. But I have thought about the virtues and skills of the wise truster. And I've written a little about this in the paper, but I was counting on you. And I take it, but I was counting on you to be a kind of signature complaint when your trust has been like violated, right? But I was counting on you, and sort of, I expected you to respond positively to the fact that I was counting on you. So, you know, but I was counting on you, or you let me down, right? And sometimes we've got norms for when there are excuses for that, right? And these are norms that point to when the person on the trust side has failed. So we've got things like, how could I possibly have known you were counting on me for that, right? And that points to we're in a domain or in a relationship where you wouldn't expect this kind of thing, because, you know, how, if I go to my doctor, how could it, and the doctor goes, how could I have known that you were counting on me to like come up with the right treatment? It's like, duh. But you could be counting on your doctor for something eccentric, right? Or friends, you know, how could I know you were counting on me for that? And so that suggests that sometimes when we're engaged in negotiating domains, right, or when we are working in ways that are not standard to social norm ways of dividing up domains, right, we might need to communicate exactly what we are counting on to whom. And we do see this developmentally in the example I talked about before, when the mum goes, you know, you're a big girl now and I'm counting on you, you're making that explicit, right? We usually don't have to make it explicit, but if there's something potentially slightly eccentric going on, we might have to make that explicit, and you would fail in your trust if you didn't make it explicit in those kinds of cases, yeah? Other things we can fail in as trusters are actually, I want to say being too demanding, being narcissistic in our trust. And I thought when, back up, what's a good example of this? When President Trump, let's go to President Trump. I know we should stop talking about President Trump, ex-President Trump, yay, phew, he's ex, right? When he first came to power, I thought that I would be really surprised if any of his core advisors continued to work for him. And he went through this whole turnover, right? And why was it? Because none of them were trustworthy, right? They were incompetent, or they weren't loyal, or they were all untrustworthy, right? And why would that be the case? Well, if you're a narcissist, you think it's all about me, it's all about me, it's all about me, right? And coming back to what is it to take a reason to be compelling, right? When you are a truster, right? You have to recognize the full agency of the other person. If you're a narcissist, you won't do that. Now, if you set a compelling bar such that it's all about me, it's all about me, right? You're going to be a really, really bad truster. You're going to fail to be wise in your trust, and you will feel that everybody is untrustworthy towards you. And that could well be because what you are asking by way of either domain or by way of compellingness is unreasonable. You haven't recognized that what you're trying to do is recruit the agency of someone else who, just like you, is a fully fledged agent. And so as the White House staff tuned over and over and over, I was thinking like, yep, that's about right. I predict, you know, narcissists just make very unwise trusters. And there's other things too, you know, about how to be wise in sustaining trust relations. And I do think Annette Beyer has got some great and wise things to say about that.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time, Karen. I realize we're a bit over already, so we can probably cut it off here, but I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope that the students do as well.
I really enjoyed it as well, so thanks for having me.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.